The wind, a relentless tormentor, scoured the high desert, flinging grit that stung Ilara's sunburnt cheeks and bit at her exposed hands, already raw from the coarse rope that bound them. Each gust seemed to carry the whispers of despair, a mournful chorus to the dirge playing in her heart. The vast, unforgiving expanse of rock and scrub stretched in every direction, a cruel mockery of the freedom she had so desperately sought. Now, freedom was a fading ember, choked by the dust of her capture. Around her, the three men, Grimes, their leader, a brutish man with eyes like chips of obsidian, and his two cohorts, equally coarse and menacing, moved with the casual cruelty of predators assured of their prey. Their laughter, when it came, was a harsh, grating sound that scraped along her already frayed nerves. She was a parcel, a bounty, her worth measured in silver dollars, her future a terrifying blank canvas upon which they could paint any horror they chose. The ache in her wrists was a dull throb compared to the sharp, persistent pain of loss that had been her companion for months, a wound torn fresh by this new indignity. Her husband, Thomas, taken by the fever, their small farm, lost to the rapacious claims of men who preyed on the vulnerable. She had been heading west, towards a cousin she barely knew, a sliver of hope in a world turned desolate. That sliver was now extinguished. The metallic tang of fear was constant in her mouth, mingling with the dust and the faint, sour scent of unwashed bodies and stale tobacco emanating from her captors. The sun beat down, merciless, reflecting off the pale rock until her eyes ached. Every rustle of sagebrush, every distant cry of a hawk, amplified her terror, her senses screaming in a silent symphony of dread. She kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, a wavering line of purple mountains that promised nothing but more hardship, trying to detach herself from the crude remarks, the leering glances. But detachment was a luxury she could not afford when her very survival hung by the thinnest of threads. The hollow in her stomach was not just from hunger, it was the emptiness of utter isolation, the crushing weight of knowing she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The second day of their grim procession bled into a third, each hour an eternity measured in the jarring rhythm of the horses' hooves and the weary drag of Ilara's own feet when they allowed her to walk. Grimes had decided to make camp earlier than usual, near a meager cluster of cottonwoods that offered scant shade but promised a seep of brackish water. As the men busied themselves with their tasks, one gathering sparse firewood, another tending the horses, Grimes gnawing on a strip of dried meat, an unnatural stillness descended upon the small hollow. The ceaseless wind seemed to hold its breath. Even the insects fell silent. Ilara, tethered to a saddle horn, felt a prickle of unease crawl up her spine, a sensation distinct from her constant fear. It was an alertness, an ancient instinct whispering of unseen eyes. Grimes, too, seemed to sense it, his chewing slowing, his head tilting almost imperceptibly. He spat onto the parched earth. "Something ain't right," he muttered, his hand instinctively going to the colt at his hip. The other two men paused, looking to him, their earlier boisterousness evaporating. The silence stretched, taut and vibrating, then snapped. It was not a sound that broke it, but a movement, a flicker at the edge of vision, so swift, so silent, it was like a phantom made real. One moment, the man by the fire was reaching for another branch, the next, he crumpled without a sound, an arrow protruding from his throat, dark and slender. Before a cry could be raised, before Grimes could even draw his weapon, a figure materialized from the rocks and shadows, a lean, copper-skinned warrior, moving with the lethal grace of a striking cougar. His face, framed by straight black hair, was a mask of focused intensity, his eyes burning with a cold fire. The second bounty hunter, lunging for his rifle, let out a strangled gasp as the warrior's knife flashed, a silver arc in the dying light, finding its mark with terrible precision. Grimes finally roared, a sound of fury and surprise, his gun clearing leather. But the Apache, Cale, was a whirlwind of deadly motion. He sidestepped the shot, the bullet whining harmlessly past, and closed the distance with blinding speed. The struggle was brief, brutal, and shockingly one-sided. Ilara watched, frozen, a silent scream trapped in her throat, as the man who had held her life in his grubby hands was overcome. When it was over, a profound, ringing silence filled the hollow, broken only by the warrior's harsh breathing and the frantic thumping of Ilara's own heart. He stood over Grimes's still form, his chest heaving, the knife still in his hand, dripping crimson. Then, slowly, he turned, and his dark, unreadable eyes fixed on her. Terror, stark and primal, seized Elara. She had merely exchanged one captor for another, perhaps one even more fearsome. The Apache warrior, Cale, regarded her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, his presence overwhelming in the sudden, deathly quiet of the hollow. He was lean but powerfully built, the muscles cording his arms and shoulders visible beneath the simple breechcloth and moccasins. His skin, the color of rich earth, bore the faint tracings of old scars, testaments to a life lived on the edge. Elara could only stare, her breath caught in her throat, her mind reeling from the swift, brutal violence she had witnessed. He was the stuff of settlers' nightmares, the feared Apache, a specter of the wilderness. He moved towards her, and she flinched, instinctively trying to shrink back, but the rope held her fast. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her torn dress, her bound wrists, the terror etched on her face. There was no readable emotion in his eyes, not triumph, not cruelty, not even curiosity. Just a deep, assessing stillness. He sheathed his knife, the movement economical and precise. Then, he reached out. Elara closed her eyes, bracing for a blow, for a rough hand. Instead, she felt the cool steel of a different knife, not against her throat, but against the ropes that bound her wrists. The fibers parted, and her hands fell free, aching and numb. She rubbed them instinctively, her gaze still fixed on him, wary, uncomprehending. He gestured towards the water-skin Grimes had dropped. A silent command. Hesitantly, she reached for it, her fingers clumsy. The water was lukewarm and tasted of leather, but it was the most precious liquid she had ever swallowed. He watched her drink, his silence as profound as the desert itself. When she had finished, he picked up a discarded strip of jerky from the bounty hunter's supplies, broke off a piece, and offered it to her. His movements were devoid of threat, yet imbued with an undeniable authority. She took the jerky, her stomach clenching with a hunger she hadn't dared acknowledge. Chewing the tough, salty meat was an effort, but it sent a welcome warmth through her. What did he want? Why had he saved her, if indeed that was what he had done? He gave no answers, only retrieved his arrows, wiped his knife on a handful of dry grass, and then, with a slight inclination of his head towards the west, where the sun was now a fiery gash on the horizon, he began to walk. He did not look back to see if she followed. Elara stood alone amidst the carnage, the silence broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind through the cottonwoods. The bodies of her former captors lay like discarded puppets. To stay meant certain death, from exposure, from thirst, or from whatever else lurked in this desolate land. To follow the warrior, that was a terrifying unknown. But he had freed her. He had offered her water and food. It was a fragile, unspoken truce, a path chosen out of sheer necessity. With a deep, shuddering breath, she took the first step, then another, her gaze fixed on the receding silhouette of the Apache warrior against the blood-red sky. The days that followed blurred into a grueling tapestry of sun-baked rock, thorny scrub, and endless, aching horizons. Cale moved with an unhurried, tireless gait, his moccasined feet seeming to find purchase where Elara saw only loose scree and treacherous inclines. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was a guttural word or two in his own tongue, usually a warning about a loose rock or a spiny cactus. His silence was a heavy cloak, forcing Elara deeper into her own thoughts, into a heightened awareness of the world around her. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture, the slight narrowing of his eyes that signaled caution, the almost imperceptible tilt of his head as he listened to sounds she could not yet discern. The landscape was an active antagonist, its beauty harsh and deceptive. The sun beat down relentlessly, draining her strength, and the nights brought a chilling cold that seeped into her bones. Her flimsy dress was torn and offered little protection, her worn-out shoes were falling apart. Cale wore the elements like a second skin, seemingly impervious to the heat and cold. He found water in places that looked utterly barren to Elara, a seep hidden beneath a cluster of rocks, moisture cupped in the leaves of a desert plant. He shared his meager rations of dried meat and scavenged roots without comment, never taking more than his share, often less. He did not coddle her, nor did he offer words of comfort. When she stumbled, he would pause, waiting for her to regain her footing, his face impassive. Yet, he never left her behind. Once, a rattlesnake, coiled in the sparse shade of a yucca, struck out as she passed too close. Before she could even scream, Cale was there, a blur of motion, his long knife severing the snake's head with a single, swift stroke. He had simply kicked the twitching body aside and moved on, leaving her trembling with a mixture of terror and a strange, burgeoning gratitude. Slowly, painstakingly, her perception of him began to shift. The terrifying savage of her imagination was gradually being replaced by the image of a man, incredibly skilled, deeply connected to this harsh land, a man who, for reasons she could not fathom, was keeping her alive. Her own resilience, buried deep beneath layers of grief and fear, began to stir. She pushed herself to keep pace, to endure the thirst and hunger, the aches and pains. Each sunrise she greeted was a small victory, a testament to her own will to survive. She watched him, learning how he moved, how he conserved his energy, how he read the signs of the land. His silence became less a source of fear and more a space for observation, a quiet classroom in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The air grew thick and heavy one afternoon, the sun a pale, diffused disk behind a gathering veil of bruised purple clouds. A low rumble echoed in the distance, growing steadily louder, closer. Cale stopped abruptly, his head tilted, sniffing the air like an animal. He scanned the narrow canyon they were traversing, his gaze sharp and urgent. He pointed towards a shallow overhang in the canyon wall, a mere indentation in the rock, and grunted a single word, the meaning clear: shelter. Rain began to fall, fat, isolated drops at first, then a torrential downpour, transforming the dry arroyo into a muddy, rushing torrent within minutes. The wind howled through the canyon, driving the rain sideways, a blinding, chilling curtain. They huddled together under the inadequate overhang, the roar of the flash flood filling the air, a deafening display of nature's raw power. Elara, soaked to the bone and shivering uncontrollably, pressed herself against the cold rock, watching in terrified awe as boulders tumbled and debris surged past them. Cale was a stoic presence beside her, his body a shield against some of the wind and rain. He had pulled a strip of hide from his small pack and, without a word, draped it over her shoulders. It was stiff and smelled faintly of smoke and animal, but it offered a sliver of warmth, a small measure of protection. The storm raged for what felt like an eternity. In the dim light, she saw a gash on his forearm, bleeding sluggishly where a sharp rock, dislodged by the deluge, must have grazed him. Before she could think, driven by an instinct she didn't know she possessed, she reached out, tearing a strip from the hem of her already ragged petticoat. Her fingers fumbled, clumsy with cold and fear, as she tried to staunch the bleeding. Cale went still, his dark eyes fixed on her face, his expression unreadable in the gloom. He did not pull away, nor did he assist. He simply allowed her to tend to the wound, her touch surprisingly gentle despite her trembling. When she had tied the makeshift bandage, their eyes met for a fleeting second. In that shared glance, across the chasm of culture and experience, something shifted. A flicker of acknowledgement, perhaps, of shared vulnerability in the face of the storm's fury. The rain eventually lessened, the roar of the flood subsiding to a sullen gurgle. The clouds began to break, and a watery shaft of sunlight pierced the gloom, illuminating the transformed landscape. Cale rose, tested his arm, and then, with a brief, almost imperceptible nod towards her, he moved to survey the path ahead. The strip of her petticoat, stained with his blood, remained tied around his arm. Elara watched him, a strange ache in her chest. He was still a mystery, a dangerous enigma, but in the heart of the storm, a fragile thread of connection had been spun, as unexpected and as vital as the sudden rain in a parched land. Days later, after traversing a landscape that grew increasingly rugged and remote, Cale led Elara to a place that felt hidden from the world. It was not a bustling camp, as she might have imagined, but a secluded, sun-drenched alcove nestled high in the mountains, accessible only by a narrow, winding game trail that would have been invisible to an untrained eye. A small, clear spring trickled from the rocks, nourishing a patch of surprisingly green grass and a few gnarled piñon pines. A simple lean-to, constructed from branches and animal hides, offered shelter against one wall of the alcove. It was a place of profound stillness, the silence broken only by the whisper of the wind in the pines and the distant call of an eagle. Cale indicated the lean-to, then set about his own tasks, gathering firewood, checking snares he must have set previously. He seemed to belong here, moving with a quiet familiarity that spoke of this being his refuge, his solitary domain. Elara, left to her own devices, felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. The constant threat of pursuit had lifted, replaced by the deep, resonant peace of this hidden place. Yet, she was still a captive of sorts, dependent on this silent, watchful man. He would leave for hours at a time, presumably hunting or scouting, disappearing into the wilderness as silently as he had first appeared. During these absences, a knot of anxiety would tighten in Elara's chest. What if he didn't return? But with each successful return, bringing a rabbit or a handful of edible roots, a little more of that anxiety would recede, replaced by a grudging reliance, a nascent trust. She began to mend her tattered clothes with a needle fashioned from a sharpened bone and thread teased from a plant Cale had shown her. She learned to identify a few edible plants, to keep the small fire alive, to listen to the language of the wilderness. The physical hardships remained, but the sharp edges of her fear and despair were slowly being blunted. The sun warmed her skin, and the clean mountain air filled her lungs. She watched Cale when he was near, observing the meticulous way he cleaned his weapons, the reverence with which he treated the animals he hunted, the deep, almost spiritual connection he seemed to have with the natural world. It was a stark contrast to the brutal wastefulness of the men who had captured her, a quiet lesson in a different way of being. Her old life, with its suffocating conventions and recent tragedies, felt a world away, a painful memory softened by the immensity of the mountains and the slow, healing rhythm of this isolated existence. The relative peace of their mountain sanctuary was shattered one crisp morning. Cale had been gone since before dawn, and Elara was tending the small fire, a newfound sense of competence warming her despite the chill air. A faint sound, out of place in the natural symphony of the alcove, made her freeze. It was the clink of metal on rock, distant but unmistakable. Her heart leaped into her throat. Cale had taught her to listen, to distinguish the footfall of a deer from that of a man. This was no animal. She scrambled to the edge of the alcove, peering down the narrow trail. Far below, almost at the base of the mountain, she saw them, 3 riders, their figures small but distinct. Not Apache. Their clothing, the way they sat their horses, marked them as white men. Bounty hunters? Or perhaps soldiers? The sun glinted off a rifle barrel. A cold dread seeped into her bones. They were searching, moving with a grim purpose that spoke of a relentless pursuit. Had Grimes's disappearance been reported? Were these men connected to him, seeking vengeance or the bounty he had failed to collect? Or were they part X000B_ of a larger, more insidious threat, the ever-encroaching wave of civilization that sought to tame this wild land and its people? Cale returned as silently as a shadow, materializing beside her so suddenly she gasped. He had seen them too. His face was grim, his eyes narrowed to slits, reflecting a cold, dangerous light. He carried his bow, and a fresh quiver of arrows was slung across his back. The air around him crackled with a sudden, lethal tension. He looked at Elara, then at the men below. He didn't need to speak, the urgency was palpable. This sanctuary was no longer safe. The past, which she had begun to hope she might escape, had found her again, its greedy tendrils reaching even into this remote haven. Her fear was different now, though. It was still potent, but it was no longer the paralyzing terror of a helpless victim. Mingled with it was a fierce desire to protect this fragile piece, this man who, against all odds, had become her protector. She remembered the casual cruelty of Grimes and his men, their utter disregard for any life but their own. These new pursuers would likely be no different. That societal judgment she had fled, the greed that had cost her farm, it all seemed embodied in those distant figures, hunting, always hunting. Cale touched her arm briefly, a light but firm pressure, then pointed towards a barely discernible path leading further up the mountain, into even more rugged, broken country. His message was clear, they had to move, and quickly. The respite was over. The wilderness, which had offered a harsh sanctuary, now demanded flight once more. The ascent was brutal, a desperate scramble over loose rock and through dense, thorny thickets. Cale moved with astonishing speed and agility, choosing paths that seemed impossible, yet Ilara, driven by a new, fierce determination, somehow kept pace. The sounds of the pursuers, though distant, were a constant goad, their occasional shouts echoing unnervingly up the mountainside. Cale's focus was absolute, his senses heightened, every line of his body taut with readiness. He was no longer just a guide, he was a warrior preparing for battle, his aura of quiet capability now charged with a deadly intent. They reached a narrow defile, a passage between towering rock spires, barely wide enough for one person to pass. Cale paused, motioning for Ilara to hide behind a cluster of boulders. He handed her his knife, not the long fighting blade, but a smaller utility knife. The gesture was profound. He was arming her, trusting her. "Stay," he commanded, one of the few English words she had heard him speak with such force. He pressed himself against the rock wall, narking an arrow to his bow, his eyes fixed on the approach to the defile. Ilara huddled behind the rocks, the cold steel of the knife a small, inadequate comfort in her hand. But it was something. She was not entirely helpless. She strained her ears, listening to the sounds of the pursuit drawing closer. The harsh voices, the clatter of hooves on stone. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but mixed with it was a burgeoning anger, a protective instinct for Cale, for the life he had given back to her. The first of the pursuers appeared at the mouth of the defile, a rough-looking man with a repeater rifle. Cale's bowstring twanged. The man cried out, clutching his shoulder, his rifle clattering to the ground. Before his companions could react, Cale loosed another arrow, then another, each finding its mark with lethal precision. It was not a prolonged battle, but a swift, deadly dance of shadows and arrows. One man went down silently. The leader, a heavier man who bellowed orders, tried to charge forward, firing his pistol wildly. Cale seemed to anticipate his every move, evading the shots, using the terrain to his advantage. Then, the unexpected happened. A fourth man, who must have circled around, appeared on a ledge above Cale, taking aim. Ilara saw him, saw the glint of the rifle barrel. There was no time to shout a warning Cale would understand. Acting on pure instinct, she scrambled up, dislodging a cascade of small stones. It was enough. The shooter, startled, momentarily shifted his aim. In that instant, Cale spun, his own knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. He threw it with incredible force and accuracy. The man on the ledge gasped, dropping his rifle, and pitched forward into the abyss. The last remaining pursuer, seeing his companions fall, turned and fled, his panicked retreat echoing through the canyon. Silence, sharp and ringing, descended once more. Cale retrieved his knife, his chest heaving, his face a grim mask. He looked at Ilara, his dark eyes holding an intensity that made her breath catch. She had not fought, not in the way he had, but she had not cowered. She had acted. She had helped. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation was a vortex of raw adrenaline and stunned silence. Cale stood, breathing heavily, his gaze sweeping the defile, ensuring no threat remained. The bodies of the pursuers lay twisted on the rocks, stark reminders of the violence that had just transpired. Ilara slowly emerged from behind the boulders, the small knife still clutched in her hand, her knuckles white. Her legs felt shaky, her heart hammered against her ribs, but a strange calm was settling over her. She had faced death, had seen it dealt with brutal efficiency, and had played a small, almost accidental part in their survival. Cale walked over to where the leader had fallen and retrieved a canteen and a small pouch of ammunition, his movements economical, devoid of any morbid curiosity. He then turned to Ilara. He didn't speak, but his eyes, usually so guarded, held a new light as they met hers. It was not gratitude, perhaps, but a flicker of respect, an acknowledgement of her presence, her unexpected intervention. He looked at the knife in her hand, then back at her face. Gently, he took it from her, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting moment. The contact sent a small shiver through her, not of fear, but of something else, something unfamiliar and unsettlingly profound. He sheathed the small knife and then picked up his bow, checking the string, his warrior's focus slowly receding, replaced by a weary vigilance. He gestured for her to follow, and they moved away from the site of the conflict, leaving the dead to the silence of the mountains. They walked for some time without speaking, the shared danger having forged a bond that transcended words. The sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a stark beauty indifferent to the life-and-death struggles played out beneath it. Ilara found herself reflecting on the woman she had been just weeks ago, terrified, helpless, adrift in a sea of grief and despair. That woman was still a part of her, her sorrows not forgotten, but she was no longer defined solely by her losses. She had endured, she had learned, she had found a strength she never knew she possessed. And she had found it here, in this harsh, unforgiving land, alongside this silent, formidable man who had, in his own inscrutable way, shown her the path to it. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the future remained uncertain. Where would they go now? Could she ever truly be safe? Yet, as she walked beside Cale, the quiet rhythm of their footsteps a counterpoint to the vast stillness of the wilderness, a sense of resilience, hard-won and precious, filled her. They found shelter for the night in a shallow cave, hidden behind a curtain of ancient junipers. Cale built a small, smokeless fire, its warmth a welcome comfort against the encroaching chill of the high-altitude evening. The silence between them was different now, less a void and more a shared space, filled with unspoken understanding. Ilara watched Cale as he cleaned his weapons, his movements precise and deliberate. The ferocity she had witnessed in him during the fight was gone, replaced by a quiet weariness, a profound stillness that seemed to draw strength from the very rocks around them. She thought of the life she had left behind, the world of settlements and so-called civilization, with its own insidious forms of brutality and judgment. Here, in the raw, untamed wilderness, life was stripped bare, its terms harsh but honest. Survival was a daily struggle, but there was a clarity to it, a directness that was absent in the convoluted cruelties of the world she had known. Cale finally looked up, his gaze meeting hers across the small fire. He held out a piece of dried meat, their now familiar ritual. As she took it, her fingers brushed his again, a fleeting contact that nonetheless resonated with the day's intensity. "You were brave," he said, his voice low, the English word startlingly clear in the quiet of the cave. It was not praise, merely a statement of fact, yet it sent a warmth spreading through Ilara that had nothing to do with the fire. She found her own voice, husky from disuse and emotion. "You saved my life." Again. A faint inclination of his head was his only reply. He did not seek thanks or acknowledgement. His actions were rooted in something deeper, a code she was only beginning to glimpse. Later, as she lay wrapped in the hide Cale had given her, feigning sleep, she knew a decision point was approaching. What path lay before her? The thought of returning to the settlements, to the vulnerability and judgment she had faced, filled her with a profound reluctance. That world seemed distant, almost alien now. Here, despite the constant danger, she had found a measure of herself, a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. The wilderness had stripped away her illusions, her helplessness, and had forged something new in their place. Cale, the feared Apache warrior, had been her unlikely savior, but he had also been her teacher. He had shown her not just how to survive in this harsh land, but how to find strength within herself. The partnership they had formed, born of necessity and shared hardship, felt more real, more vital, than any connection she had known before, save for that with her lost Thomas. As the fire dwindled to glowing embers, Ilara looked out at the stars, brilliant and impossibly distant in the clear night sky. A sense of quiet determination settled within her. Her journey was far from over, but she would face it not as a victim, but as a survivor, her spirit tempered by the fire of the desert and the quiet strength of the warrior who slept soundly nearby, a silent guardian in the vast, listening night. The future was an unmarked trail, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to walk it.